silence of the early morning on February 27, 2026, was not the peace of a region finding its footing, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a cataclysm. In the gilded rooms of Geneva, the air was thick with the desperate scent of failing diplomacy. Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Basidi had spent days walking the narrow corridors between two worlds that refused to meet. In one room, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi maintained a stance of defiant sovereignty, insisting that enrichment would continue and nothing would leave Iranian soil. In the other, United States envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner held a line that had become an ultimatum. The world watched, clinging to a fragile hope that a deal in principle had been reached, but beneath the surface, the gears of war were already grinding. President Donald Trump, monitoring the situation from Mar-a-Lago, had reached his breaking point. He had promised his base no more stupid wars, yet he found himself cornered by a regime that he believed had learned nothing from the strikes of the previous year. On that Friday afternoon, the facade of negotiation finally crumbled. Trump declared he was not happy with the progress, and within hours, the diplomatic wire was cut. The transition from the boardroom to the war room was instantaneous. At the White House, Vice President J.D. Vance, Energy Secretary Chris Wright, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gathered in the Situation Room, linked by a secure line to the president's private facility in Florida. For 2 months, the commander of United States Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, had been kept at arm's length. But on this night, he was finally brought into the inner circle. He presented the president with a menu of destruction: surgical strikes, sustained air campaigns, or a coordinated decapitation of the Iranian state. The intelligence was high fidelity, and the targets were locked. United States intelligence had tracked the movement of the most dangerous nuclear material on the planet to an underground conversion facility in Isfahan. Simultaneously, a target of opportunity emerged that was too significant to ignore. American and Israeli intelligence confirmed that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with his top military and political command, were scheduled to meet at a compound on Pasteur Street in downtown Tehran on Saturday morning. The ultimatum had been rejected, not in words, but through the stubborn persistence of a nuclear program that refused to die. Trump's administration had initially signaled that the goal was merely to stop enrichment, but as the hours ticked toward midnight, the mission morphed into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous: regime change. The political logic was cold and calculated. If the head of the snake could be removed in a single blow, perhaps the body would wither without the need for a bloody ground invasion. Yet, history has a way of punishing those who believe in clean victories. As the world's largest warship, the USS Gerald R. Ford, arrived off the coast of Israel, and the American embassy in Jerusalem ordered an immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel, the signal was clear. The time for talking had ended. The world was no longer waiting for a deal. It was waiting for the first explosion. The war had not just entered its deadliest phase, it had been invited in by the failure of those who thought they could master the art of the deal with a nation that viewed every compromise as a surrender. February 28, 2026, at 8 to 10 in the morning, local Tehran time, the skies over the Iranian capital didn't just darken, they shattered. The Pentagon called it Operation Epic Fury, but to the Israelis, it was Operation Roaring Lion. This was not a midnight shadow operation. It was a brazen daylight assault designed to catch a regime in its most vulnerable moment, in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan and on the Jewish Sabbath. Intelligence had revealed a target of opportunity that occurs perhaps once in a generation. At a heavily guarded compound on Pasteur Street, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was meeting with his top civilian and military brass. The element of surprise was total. Israel launched 200 fighter jets, the largest single sortie in its history, striking 500 targets across the nation in a synchronized tidal wave of fire. The strike was a masterpiece of intelligence and deception. For a decade, Israeli Signals Intelligence Unit 8200 had hacked the very traffic cameras that monitored the streets of Tehran. They knew the patterns of life for every driver, every bodyguard, and every cleric in the supreme leader's inner circle. As 30 precision munitions tore through the roof of the meeting hall, the command structure of the Islamic Republic was severed in half a minute. By the time the dust settled, Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled for 36 years, was gone. Alongside him, 40 senior commanders, including the defense minister and top Revolutionary Guard leaders, were eliminated. President Trump quickly took to social media to confirm the death of a man he described as one of the most evil in history, signaling that the hour of freedom for the Iranian people had arrived. However, the clean victory the West envisioned was immediately stained by the brutal reality of war. In the southern city of Manab, a missile, whether a stray or a calculated risk, struck an all-girls elementary school. Reports trickled out of the rubble, 50, then 80, And finally, over 140 people had lost their lives, many of them young students at their desks. The images of mourning in the streets of Iran were no longer about revolution or politics. They were about the sheer agony of a population caught between a dying dictatorship and the raw power of a global superpower. Trump had claimed the mission was to ensure Iran never possessed a nuclear weapon, but the targets hit the parliament, the National Security Council, and the residential palaces told a different story. This was a decapitation strike, a war of choice aimed at total regime change, launched without the consent of Congress or the United Nations. As the first wave of 900 United States strikes concluded, the world realized that the ultimatum hadn't just been rejected, it had been buried under the wreckage of Tehran. But a regime this deep, this multi-layered, does not die with one man. The Iranian response was coming, and it would be faster and more ferocious than anyone in Washington had dared to calculate. The assumption that the death of a leader is the death of a cause is a recurring fallacy in the history of warfare. Within minutes of the news that the supreme leader was dead, the Middle East witnessed a display of calculated, decentralized fury. Iran did not wait to mourn. It moved immediately into a weapons-free mode, activating a strategy developed 21 years earlier known as the Mosaic Defense. The central command in Tehran may have been reduced to rubble, but the country was divided into 31 autonomous units, each prepared to fight a guerrilla-style war without a head. Iranian military units were now out of contact, operating under standing orders to inflict maximum damage on any target within reach. This was Operation True Promise 4, a multi-vector retaliation that turned the entire region into a front line. The first waves of Iranian ballistic missiles and drones did not just target Israel, they aimed at the heart of the American presence in the Gulf. In Bahrain, the headquarters of the United States Navy Fifth Fleet was hit, sending smoke rising over the horizon. Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates and Al Udeid in Qatar were engulfed in the roar of sirens and the flashes of orange as air defenses worked to intercept hundreds of incoming threats. Even as American officials claimed high success rates for their interceptions, the reality on the ground was far more chaotic. 6 American service members were confirmed dead in Kuwait after a strike on a tactical operations center that commanders had previously warned was indefensible. For the first time in decades, the United States was facing the realization that the more assets it deployed to the region, the more targets it provided for a cornered adversary. The psychological dimension of this war extended far beyond military installations. In Dubai, a city that had long modeled itself as a sanctuary of global commerce and luxury, the war arrived in the form of a Shahed drone, striking the iconic Burj Al Arab Hotel. The Fairmont Palm Hotel was also hit, and Dubai International Airport, the busiest in the world, was forced to close indefinitely, throwing global air traffic into a logistical black hole. But the most lethal blow was delivered at the Strait of Hormuz. Iran announced the total blockade of this 21-mile choke point through which 20% of the world's oil passes. Within 24 hours, the price of Brent crude surged by 20%, crossing $80 a barrel and heading toward a forecasted $150. Global stock markets reacted with terror. Trading was halted in South Korea after a 10% crash, and Japanese markets suffered massive losses as the world realized the global economy was being held hostage by a war it could not control. The ultimatum had been rejected, and the cost of that rejection was now being calculated in blood and trillions of dollars in lost market value. While smoke billowed from the ruins of Tehran, a different kind of fire began to consume the political landscape in Washington. The Trump administration claimed the decapitation of the Iranian leadership was a masterstroke of security, but the American public was far from convinced. A CNN poll conducted in the immediate aftermath of the strikes revealed that nearly 60% of Americans disapproved of the decision to attack Iran. As the reality of the conflict set in, the president's overall approval rating cratered to a second-term low of 38%. For many, the imagery of war did not represent strength, but a dangerous lurch into another forever war that Trump had explicitly promised to avoid. Congressional leaders, from both the Democratic and Republican parties, were horrified by the lack of consultation. They argued that the president had bypassed the United States Constitution, which grants Congress the sole power to declare war. Fast-tracked articles of impeachment began to circulate in the House of Representatives, targeting the administration for obstruction of justice and the unauthorized use of military force. In the Middle East, a complex and dirty game was unfolding that threatened to shatter the fragile alliances of the region. Saudi Arabia's state oil company, Aramco, was forced to shut down its refinery in Ras Tanura following a series of drone strikes. While initial reports blamed Iran, Tehran issued a firm denial, stating they would never attack their brothers in such a manner. A disturbing theory began to gain traction among intelligence circles. that the attack was a false flag operation orchestrated by Israel to force Saudi Arabia into the conflict. Analysts warned that if this were confirmed, it would have regional implications for a generation, potentially turning the entire Gulf against the Western coalition. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis inside Iran was becoming a focal point for global condemnation. The strike on the girls' school in Minab had claimed 140 lives, including 26 female teachers. The Iranian people were not taking to the streets with photos of Donald Trump to welcome liberation. Instead, they were gathering to mourn their children and side with their regime in a moment of existential threat. The West's hope that the death of the supreme leader would lead to a democratic revolution was quickly proven to be a fantasy. Iran had prepared for this vacuum for decades. Within 48 hours, the Assembly of Experts met under fire and announced the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ayatollah. He is described by experts as an even more extreme hardliner than his father, the man responsible for the brutal crackdown on 30,000 protesters in early January. The Islamic Republic was not collapsing, it was hardening. Successors for all 40 eliminated commanders had already been designated and were assuming control of the Mosaic Defense. As European allies like France and the United Kingdom publicly criticized the United States for engaging in a war outside of international law, the Trump administration found itself isolated. The war had entered a phase where tactical military victories were being completely overshadowed by a strategic and moral collapse. The ultimatum had been rejected, and the replacement was a more radicalized, wounded, and unpredictable adversary that now had nothing left to lose. The illusion of a clean, decisive victory began to evaporate as the cost of this new forever war was tallied not just in blood, but in the cold arithmetic of logistics and international law. While President Trump boasted on social media of having virtually unlimited munitions, the reality inside the Pentagon was far more desperate. By the fifth day of the conflict, the administration was forced to call an emergency meeting with executives from major defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon to discuss accelerating weapons production. The United States was rapidly burning through its inventory of high-tech interceptor missiles, such as the Patriot and THAAD systems, trying to counter a swarm of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles that cost a mere fraction of the defensive weapons used to stop them. This stark economic asymmetry meant that even if the United States achieved air superiority, it was losing the war of attrition. Military analysts warned that if the interceptor stockpiles ran dry, the massive naval fleet surrounding Iran would be transformed from a projection of power into a collection of vulnerable targets. As the military campaign sputtered, the domestic political foundations of the Trump administration were being rocked by legal detonations in a federal courtroom. Attorney General Pam Bondi, testifying under oath, admitted that the president had instructed the destruction of logs related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, citing national security as a transparent fig leaf for what prosecutors called a felony obstruction of justice. This testimony corroborated earlier statements from former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, painting a picture of a coordinated multi-agency cover-up. Critics began to refer to the conflict as Operation Epstein Fury, suggesting the entire war was a calculated distraction from the president's own legal peril. Trump's public rage on Truth Social, where he vilified his once loyal attorney general as weak, only reinforced the narrative of a man cornered by the truth and lashing out at the world to maintain his grip on power. The international community, once divided, began to turn decisively against the American-led offensive. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom and French President Emmanuel Macron both condemned the invasion as being outside the bounds of international law. Even long-standing regional allies were rethinking their involvement as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz strangled global energy supplies. Only 3 oil and gas tankers were recorded crossing the strait in a single week, a de facto closure that sent shockwaves through the economies of Europe and Asia. Ironically, the chaos in the Middle East was serving as a massive economic gift to Russia, whose crude oil was suddenly in higher demand as the world's traditional supply lines were severed. The ultimatum had been rejected, and in its place was a regional configuration where the United States was increasingly isolated, its military was being bled white by cheap drones, and its president was facing an impeachment engine that was roaring to life with unprecedented speed. The fires across the Middle East continue to burn with an intensity that suggests the true heat of the conflict has only just moved into the shadows. What was promised to the American people as a quick, decisive masterstroke is now being re-evaluated by analysts as potentially the greatest miscalculation of a career. Even the absolute technological dominance shown in the opening hours, when a single F-35 Lightning II eliminated 6 Iranian 4 Phantoms in less than 10 minutes, could not deliver a final surrender. The war has entered its deadliest phase because it has transitioned from a conventional battle of machines into a decentralized battle of wills, where the lack of a central command in Tehran has left Iranian military units in a permanent weapons-free mode. The decentralized Mosaic Defense strategy, developed years ago to survive a decapitation strike, is now functioning exactly as intended, turning every province into an independent front that refuses to stop firing. The centerpiece of the initial assault, the high-stakes bombing of nuclear facilities at Fordo and Isfahan, is now haunted by a single, catastrophic intelligence failure. Just 3 days before the American bunker buster bombs fell, 16 cargo trucks were photographed leaving the facility under the cover of darkness. 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium material that is a single technical step from weapons grade is now missing, likely hidden in mountain tunnels or mobile units that no Western satellite can track. While the White House claims to have obliterated the nuclear threat, the reality is that the program has merely become a ghost, making it more dangerous and unpredictable than ever before. The element of surprise was achieved in the air, but the strategic prize appears to have slipped through the fingers of the coalition just 72 hours before the first strike. Meanwhile, the gamble of regime change has produced the very humanitarian and political nightmare that history warned against in Afghanistan and Iraq. By assassinating the 85-year-old supreme leader during the holy month of Ramadan, the coalition did not spark a democratic revolution. They created a martyr for 300 million Shiites across the region. The strike on the girls' school in Minab, which claimed 140 lives, has effectively silenced the Iranian opposition, as ordinary citizens now side with their own regime in a desperate struggle for survival. The Islamic Republic has not collapsed. It has instead hardened into a brutal military dictatorship under Mojtaba Khamenei, a leader even more extreme than his father, who now presides over a wounded nation with nothing left to lose. The global consequences are now mounting at a pace that the stock markets cannot absorb. With the Strait of Hormuz de facto closed by naval mines and radio threats, 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply is currently frozen. Brent crude has surged past $120 per barrel, triggering massive inflation that hits every family from Washington to New Delhi. As the United States military warns of many more American casualties to come, the political consensus for this war of choice is fracturing at home. The world is left to realize that starting a war is easy, but ending one without a coherent strategy or a willing partner for peace is nearly impossible. The Middle East has become a logistical black hole, and the war has entered a cycle of escalation where the only thing certain is that the greatest costs are yet to be paid.